Well met, Visley.
Well met indeed.
So it's Jordan Peacock and Tyler Peacock from Sortilege, and we're going to talk a little bit about session zeros. I'm running a long-standing Invisible Sun campaign, and he's been doing D&D for a bit. We're going to talk a little bit about how they intersect and collide and diverge, and how you can use them to tell fascinating stories.
I'm Tyler, and I've only ever run D&D, although I'm quite fond of doing so. Primarily, I run my own worlds, but I've run the occasional module as well. I've run for anything from 1 to 7 different players at once, and so the levels of complexity can get rather interesting at times. Great fun, though.
Now, seven's more than I'm willing to go. I think 5 is about my cap. For anything like that's really heavy, that has a lot of where I have to basically have a mental model of like what the players' equipment and stats and things are. Um, I mean, I know there's some GMs that just straight up just don't care, but I can't quite cross that threshold. I need to at least have some semblance because Lord knows I don't know anything else that's going on. I have to at least have some sense of what's going on. But
Very
before we get
much.
to that point, you have the session before things really kick off, and usually it's a kind of like tidying things up. How do you do that on the D&D front?
A lot of the time, I do my setup prior to ever actually meeting. Personally, I find it helps when we actually all get together to play to run quite a bit more smoothly if I've done like individual prep work with the players, what they want and such, like before we ever actually meet up and sit down at the table, or in this case, meet online, because COVID has some interesting restrictions imposed on tabletop role-playing games.
Do you do that strictly one-on-one, or is there a little bit of a will it blend group dynamic?
There's definitely sometimes a bit of a blend. There will be times when I have a chance to really get in detail with somebody and what they want to run, what sort of character they want to be, how they want that character to fit. Other times we'll just talk on the group chat and go, what do you think about this as an idea? Or I've got this sort of idea going on. Here's the sort of setting. It's urban or it's rural. These are the main races around. These are normal ones. If you want to use something that isn't a normal one, we're going to have to find some way that I, as the DM, can justify its position. Because if I can't make a place for it in my world, in my head, and justify its existence, I'm going to have a lot of trouble figuring out how this character that's not really supposed to be there is actually there.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, as a player, if I'm making a character for your world, I want to know your world so I can screw with it. I don't want to make something that just randomly doesn't fit.
It allows me to have some semblance of continuity of environment. It gives you more of a sense of, I believe the term is verisimilitude. You can suspend your disbelief a little better because there's a semblance of what you expect to be around is usually what is around. And if you're not from that area, there is justification for how you got there. Even if that never comes up in game, for me to have it in the back of my mind allows me to roleplay the NPCs better, adjust for environment a little bit better, make sure that the action and the interactions are plausible.
Yeah.
And that lends to the game being more interactively friendly for the players. Now, you, on the other hand, you've been trying to do Session Zero stuff with Invisible Sun. Now, as I understand it, that's an entirely different set of expectations.
Yeah, and that's something where, to me, there's almost two different kinds of session zeros, because there's the process by which you acquire players to play a game, and there's a little bit of like a speed dating kind of feeling out, because honestly, like, there's lots of different kinds of role-playing games, and I'm opinionated. Like, there's lots of games I don't want to play. There's
Totally.
lots of GMs I do not want to play with, or players that I do not want to play with.
Yep.
And the same for everybody else. And so finding the right kinds of people where you're like, okay, I could run with you for a while. I really lucked out with just a really random ragtag group of people, many of whom didn't have that much experience, but they were down for it. And I'm like, well, I'm happy to teach you as long as you're willing to learn. We can work with this, and to some extent, it's helpful because if you're using a new system, like if someone is maybe only got a year or two of experience and all they've ever done is like D&D 5e, they're going to be really comfortable working within that. And when you start throwing other things at them, they're going to go, oh, what's going on? Whereas if you have someone who has nothing, or like, yeah, I did something, but it was 10 years ago, I don't remember it, then you basically have a clean slate, and you can throw whatever gnarly things. It's also helpful for me because I homebrew the shit out of mechanics. Like I do not.
Totally.
I am not precious about anything that's published.
Totally. I'm exactly the same way with D&D. Like, I will pull stuff from everywhere. I will adjust on the fly. I'll go, yeah. Even those of you who are used to knowing all the stats of the monster manual, you don't know about this one because this guy got booby-trapped. There was a time, for instance...
I mean, really, you think about it, it's like populations, right? The stats in the monster manual are kind of like the median.
It's on average, that's what you're expecting to find. There's always the odd one,
That's the spirit. Yeah. So to me, there's that pre-conversation, and then as part of it as well is feeling out. Like I actually have my players fill out a questionnaire, and it's like, what kind of experience do you have? But also like, what kind of things are you really wanting to experience? Like, what kinds of things excite you about this concept? And then what kinds of things do you not want to go? Like, and that can be anything. And a lot, especially with a game like Invisible Sun, where there's a lot of really, it's a game about surrealism and magic, but surrealism can be quirky or it can be nightmarish. And there's really like both sides of that spectrum available, and you can kind of lean as hard into one side or the other as you want. And so you need the players to be on board with that if that's the direction you're going. And there's nothing wrong with a quirky game. There's nothing wrong with a horror game, as long as you're really upfront about it, because the right time for them to get off is before you even meet, if that's what you're doing. I'll have some fun stories for another time around. Let's just say that one of my players has literally had a therapy session in character, in game, which was one of my highlights as a GM. But
now,
go ahead.
I'd like to come back to something here. You talked about making sure that you talk to your players about what they want and what they don't want. Now, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is that D&D, for instance, is based on 3 primary pillars. There's social interaction, exploration, and combat. And those 3 pillars make up most of the game and most of the expectations that you might have of the game as mechanics go. Are you talking about expectations of game mechanics like that? Or are you talking about an expectation of the feel of the game, the sort of stuff that might be off limits, the stuff that might be okay? Are we talking about the overall color template or the mechanisms?
Both. So I'm asking about what kind of play experience do people want? Right. Do they want something that's really crunchy and really combat heavy? Because I'm not going to be the one that gives that to them. I do have combat and I do use mechanics at times, but I will have sessions where like I've forgotten to roll the dice and it's been 3 hours. I mean, that's just, I lean much more on the improv side of the spectrum and much more towards the social political drama, inner struggle, other things like that, which can be mechanical, but often aren't. Often it's much more about eliciting from the players, deep questions of their characters. So if you have someone who just wants to play like a Gloomhaven style, 0-dimensional character, go play Gloomhaven. It's great. It's just, it's not that same experience.
I gotcha.
And similarly to that, it's things like, how do you feel if I kill your character? Is that a place that you even want to go? What do you feel about, questions around like body autonomy and stuff like that? Like that's a huge issue that you want to tread very carefully around. And even just simple things like, how do you want to be introduced to the group? Do you want to use your real name? What are your preferred pronouns? Like, just being respectful of the players, because they didn't know each other prior to coming to my game. Well,
Okay.
There's a married couple. They knew each other, but nobody else knew each other. So that's the prior stuff. And then there's the actual like formal sit down for the first time, meet each other.
Totally. Now, setting up player environment is probably one of the most important things you can do as someone running a tabletop RPG. Setting up not only player expectations of what they are going to be getting themselves into by playing a game run by you, which will be different from anyone else, but also the fact that there has to be a sense of trust between the players and the GM, as well as the players amongst themselves. And they have to be comfortable with the idea that not only are you going to be trusted to run the game in which their characters are played in a way that they can appreciate and enjoy, but that the other players are not going to ruin their fun deliberately, and that if someone is doing so, you will arbitrate.
Yeah.
Is that a hard atmosphere to cultivate, or does that depend on the group?
There's a lot that you can do to kind of telegraph that, problems will be handled in these ways. These are things that will and will not be tolerated. A lot of that is kind of, so as you, the GM, and like meeting these people, you might have already handled that, but at the session 0 is the first time that they might be meeting each other. And
That's
so
true.
there's a trust building process that has to happen collaboratively, regardless of what conversations you had with them individually. If this is their first time really sitting down and saying more than 2 words to each other, then there's going to be a process, and that's not going to happen right away.
Right.
But you can foster it. And I feel like the Invisible Sun gives a very scripted session 0, the first session.
How so?
So they actually have like a separate handout in the GM envelope, and they have a whole chapter in the player guide, which is it's called The Key, where it's after all their like money and good stuff, and they basically walk through. It's like, look, you're going to have an 80% built character after you walk through the character generation. The rest of it is reserved for the first session. So it's not like it's specifically you can't do it until there are other people.
Ah, right. So in this case, what you're saying is that no Invisible Sun character can be built completely in a vacuum.
Yeah, you cannot build it by yourself.
Why can you not build it all by yourself?
So what happens is particularly around the setting of your character. So you say, this is my character, this is their this is their foundation, like where they live, how long have they been in the world, the actuality that's there. And you might define what their house is like. And then what happens is then the other players say, okay, your house is next to these neighbors. There's these local features. There's these shops nearby. There's these quirks of the environment. And they brainstorm it. And you're not allowed to contribute to your own. You select from everybody else's ideas, and you reward the ideas that you like. And so you generate a bunch of ideas, and each person picks one for themselves for their area, and then you go on to the next person. So each person gets to be the highlight, and all the other players get to ask any questions that they want to figure out like what would be something cool to be a feature for this other character. And so you get to know each player's character a little bit better. But also, I mean, the ideas are just all over the place. I've done this. I've been on both ends of it a couple times, and it's just ludicrous because it's a surrealist Magic game. So you're like, yeah, this street just like walks through the city, and
just for the case of anyone who's not familiar with the term, what does surrealist mean?
Basically, you can go as nonsensical as you like. It's treating magic as if magic is genuinely weird. It makes
talking Alice in Wonderland or what?
I have pulled from all kinds of sources. I've pulled from Alice in Wonderland. I've pulled from Promethea. Bugs Bunny, Doom Patrol, um, you know, Mad Max, just like,
Okay.
throw it all in a blender. Basically, like if you can think it, you can find some plausible way to shoehorn it.
Right.
But
So
yeah,
the
so
place where
you end up
the
with
place where they grow Christmas corpses in order to decorate for the particular holiday.
exactly.
You cut them down at the legs and stand them up in a plant pot, and you decorate the arms and ribs with ornaments.
Yeah, we came up with a gang that was the Sarges that basically would, they were like a union busting gang, but their whole thing was that they preserved historical neighborhoods.
Right.
So it was a whole bunch of like crude tough guys that were like, this is a really elegant column that we don't want to see demolished. Or we had one character who lived in kind of the government bureaucratic marquee quarter,
Mm-hmm.
and we decided that there was like a 3 square block area that was micro zoned because the zoning commission only, their nominal authority stretched through the whole city, but like effectively their authority was limited to this 3 block area. And so by God, they zoned the hell out of that area.
Oh, that's some good stuff right there.
But as the GM, I'm sitting here like I'm just observing this, right?
Totally.
The players are all coming up with this, and you end up with a couple dozen different features of the things that are the everyday lives, parts of the everyday life of these characters.
Now, what this does, from what I'm hearing, is it provides you with environment that you didn't know existed because the players are deciding it for each other, which does a couple of things. First of all, it would give the players more reason to be involved with each other because they would recognize some of the ideas that they helped come up with in the other people's stories, which is, well, people care about what they make. It's just how people are. But not only that, you as the GM would then be finding out aspects of your world that you didn't know. How often, like, is it a common or uncommon thing for you to hear some of the things that these people come up with and go, I'm stealing that and I'm making that a major plot point?
So there's a couple elements of this. I'll say one from the session 0 aspect of it, which is in addition to neighborhood features, you're also establishing the bonds between player characters.
Mm-hmm.
So each player character has at least one bond to another player character, and there's actually mechanics associated with each type.
Okay.
So you might say that we're housemates, or we're lovers, or we were fellow students, or maybe we're rivals or relatives, and like each thing has kind of a mechanical component to it. But now there's a stake to it, right? Now it's you're not just like Joe Random. It's like, oh yeah, we went to school together. My character went to the same fraternity as yours, or
Okay.
what have you. And so then, and the second thing is that when you're designing the character as well, you create a character arc, which is the narrative arc that your character is caring about right now. Each character has their own, and the biggest change, I think, from like D&D to Invisible Sun stems from the fact that the experience system happens on this individual progression level. So no two characters are following the same arc necessarily, or for the same reasons. And so
So one might be stymied and another's progressing quite a ways.
Exactly, yeah. So in a given session, there will be uneven experience awarded to players as a rule. And so what you're then working with is you're taking these very diverse characters, and they all have their own different things that they're trying to accomplish. And now they've populated this world with all these things that you didn't know existed. And so you want to kind of come to the idea of a campaign. And I'm saying campaign because like the games that I've played in and the games that I've run are legit, like long running stories that have many moving parts. But you come to it very humbly. You come to it with seeds of ideas and kind of scenes and pastiches and problems. And you're like, all right, how can I weave these disparate things together and get inspiration from the things that they just came up with? And honestly, like that's where some of the most load-bearing portions of the plot have ended up coming from, have been these serendipitous creative sparks that have come up from the players.
All right. Now, what I'm hearing then is the way you approach it in particular. I'm going to ask you another question about that in a second. But first of all, the way you approach it in particular is that you're not constructing a campaign before you get there. You're coming up with ideas that you'd like to explore, and then you're going to see whether you can get there, and if so, how, after you learn a bit more about who the characters are and how they interrelate and some of the extra features that have come about.
Yeah, I have some really big ideas that are like way up here, where it's like, okay, I have a very general sense of where I want things to go.
Yeah.
And then I have a bunch of small ideas where it's like, okay, well, we can do this immediately, or we could do this at any time. Or when we get to this location, we could do this sort of thing. And then in between there is the gap that then you use these other ideas to start knitting them together.
Now, you also describe yourself as being a very sort of improv-heavy GM, as it were.
Yes.
The idea that you were just going to run with something that came up either in your head off the top, just in a random moment, or you saw a moment between the players and went, it's worth exploring, and you take that and you push it further. But can Invisible Sun also be run in a more scripted fashion?
It can. So it's...
Like, is this an improv-based game as a GM that is very reliant on external as well as internal creativity? Or is this something where you can have a fixed arc that you can then sort of tweak to make fit with different players, but where you don't have to do as much of the burden of putting things together?
So the writer-designer, Monty Cook, actually used to write some of the D&D books. And had actually started... I think he parted ways partway through, but I think he started on the 5th edition design and some of those things. So like he's rooted in that tradition, and he ended up doing like the Cypher and Numenera and the Strange and then Invisible Sun. Invisible Sun then is coming from the very mechanically constrained fantasy role-playing world. And it's breaking out of that towards what you see at the other extreme, a lot of the indie RPGs that are basically pure improv with just like some basic structural prompts. Invisible Sun is reaching that direction, but it's rooted very much in the mechanical fantasy RPG world. It's just doing it differently. So I ignore more of those aspects than a lot of people, because my sympathies are much more with the improv side than the mechanics heavy side. But they're there, albeit in largely simplified fashion. So most monsters are just a level, and anything that you're doing with them that's the challenge level, and there's little tweaks that you can do. But it's fairly simplified stat blocks for the most part.
Does that put a lot of onus on you as the GM in the moment running a game? Like, does it make what you're doing sometimes seem forced or random, do you think, from the player's perspective? Or are you somehow able to make things scripted enough in time for things to go pretty well? Like, how often do you have these moments of hiccups where you're struggling and you watch the players sort of have difficulty keeping up and keeping themselves involved? Like, does that happen often?
So from my perspective, it's not that big of a challenge, because if I do get well and truly stumped, I'll just kind of put a pin in a scene and determine kind of what the stakes are. But generally speaking, I can explore that separately at a later time. We can retcon something. So for instance, or depending on where we are in the night, maybe we just call it for the night. I'm like, I need to figure that out. We had this one hilarious example where I had created this tower. It looked like a rook, just this giant rook. And in my notes, sorry, what?
Like a chess rook.
Like a chess rook, yeah. And in my notes, I just said, this was a Vizsla, this magical person who had changed themselves to look like a tower. And that was it. I didn't really have any like big genius plans behind it. And one of the players was really observant, and at the end of the session went up to it and had a special ability that allowed them to talk to anything, and they talked to it. And so I replied.
Okay.
And then I'm like, oh shit, I have no idea what comes next. So it was just kind of like, we're gonna put a pin on that. It's towards the end of the night, but you can come back and have a conversation, and I will have a conversation prepared.
Okay.
But then there's a later session where, with that same character, one of the players wove a spell to have a conversation with it that I was just not expecting, and we ended up with a 20-minute conversation that was pure me pulling it out of my butt.
If I recall you talking about that one correctly, that ended up having major implications on the world you've been building.
Yeah, it ended up being a significant plot point, a significant character. On the improvisational aspect, there's an entire class of sorts. They have a different structure. They call them orders. There's 5. There's 4 orders, and then there's like the absence of an order. And one of the orders is weavers, where they take different ideas and they basically improvise spells. So literally, if you want to lean into that improv style side mechanically, basically you get to make up spells all the time if you're
If you specify their ability to work together to get the desired result.
Yeah. So you have some constraints that you have to work within, but just recently, my player that's doing a weaver was stuck in the equivalent of like a meth lab and was about to get busted, and managed to escape with her friends through some quick-witted weaving. Just like, we were never here, we're gonna disappear.
Okay. Was it a difficult thing to pull off?
Well, I mean, once she kind of pitches the idea, there's basic constraints that they have to fulfill. And as long as those check out, it's just a simple test for success like any other spell.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's how I've ended up using some of those things. But those things came out of seeds that were just, offhand remarks. And a lot of them ended up becoming, so I took the notes from that session, and then I sat down and I scripted what ended up being like the first 3 sessions. And I really heavily relied on the ideas that they came up with and used them in a combination that they weren't expecting to produce a really interesting opening set of scenes. And it was also allowed me to explore the different aspects of the game. So we were able to do a big social gala and then turn that into a huge fight with monsters and then a bit of an exploration. So, trying those different flavor profiles.
Now,
and that gives me a good read. Sorry, brief interruption. Doing that in those first few sessions then also gave me a good read of what works for this set of players. It gives them a chance to kind of road test the system and their character in these different contexts. And it gives me feedback as to, oh, they're liking this, they're not liking this. I can, add more of the one, less of the other.
What sort of expectations did you find the players had of how this sort of game would work? I mean, were they expecting? Do they come in expecting that games like this tend to be combat heavy? Do they tend to be role play heavy? Was there any aspect of the game that really surprised them that they were perhaps less prepared mentally for interacting with?
I think we were all expecting it to be more like combat against monsters heavy than it's ended up being. In large part because people find really clever ways to avoid fighting.
That's really true.
Like I'm not one to force people into battles for the heck of it. And even the battles that I've kind of tried to force into them, they've come up with some ingenious ways to just diffuse the situation or sidestep it or get captured or what have you. And I think that's great. For me, if it's telling the story, if it's digging into the characters, like, I don't really care. I'm trying to,
so it's working.
It's working. Yeah. It's maybe not working the way that I had anticipated, but if it's working, it's working. I'm not going to fight that.
Yeah, you throw them a curveball, they throw a knuckleball back, and one of you eventually drops it. But until then, it's great fun to watch the other person figure out, what do we do with this now?
Actually, the real fun thing has been secrets in the battles of wits, and in particular, I've used I've set them up with some NPCs where they have effectively been put in a bind based on their obligations to other characters or based on potential for blackmail or things like that. So it's not something where you can just like roll a dice and get out of. It's
No,
something where you're gonna have to figure out like, what can I do?
because this goes deep now. It goes to a lot of different people, and they're not letting go of their strings.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's and that goes back to, I think, my first um, the first computer role playing game that I really got into and played was Deus Ex. And I
Okay.
love the fact that like you could solve things differently. You could go in fighting, you could sneak around, you could talk to people, and also like you could fail a mission and the game kept going, and it just kept going with you having failed the mission. And that was pretty formative for me, where it was like, okay, one of the worst feelings I've ever had in games, like I've had this with some Call of Cthulhu and other things, where it's like, the keeper has a secret in mind and they're like, roll the dice, and you don't get the number, and it's like, well, you don't get the secret.
Hmm.
That's bullshit. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a disappointing feeling as a player, because you want to be rewarded
Give me
for.
wrong information.
Yeah, it's the idea of uh, success with complications, or
Yeah.
failure but not complete, or something like that. You want that. Sometimes it's nice to have a buffer like that. Like D&D doesn't have that in its base mechanics. It's a success or failure. They might have the odd thing here and there with if you fail by X or more margin, different effect.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of, here's the DC, you make it or you don't. Now, I know for my part as a DM, even in D&D, sometimes I've said to myself, okay, you fail, but it's close, so it's not going to be a complete failure. You get this effect, you learn this information, it's problematic, or you've made a hit, but now your weapon's in trouble, or something like that. Because sometimes, flavorfully, the way the player has gone about what they wanted to do, complete failure does not seem like a reasonable result for me as the game master.
That's part of the thing too. I think that I really think Invisible Sun was developed trying to socialize people who had grown up with D&D into a more flexible type of format,
Okay.
because they have built in, so two of the main experience tokens that you get are Joy and Despair, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which, first of all, the fact that you need both uh, is really interesting. It means that, hey, good and bad things need to happen to your character for you to progress. It's not
Uh-huh.
just going to be all one or the other, but they can be awarded in game as well through what they call a GM shift. And I don't really do this because I've socialized my players where it's just not necessary. But
Okay.
in the game, they're very explicit of like, look, you can override a dice roll, you can override anything, and just be like, I'm going to mess up your day, but I'm going to give you a despair, or I'm going to like,
Okay.
you thought you had lost that, but you actually won, and I'm going to give you a joy. Like the GM is kind of putting their thumb on the scale, and they're going to tip the balance, for or against you, and they're
Okay.
going to mechanically reward you for that. You're going to get an experience token for that.
And because of the fact that you need both, sometimes the GM specifically making you fail at something works in your story's arc benefit.
Oh, I made one of my players' lives hell uh, for the first while, and then they ended up buying a spell, and they had like three more despair than they had joy, or something like that.
Okay.
And so I kind of hand selected, and this is another one of those things. I'll come back to the spell selection in a minute. Um, the Actually, that's a good idea to close on. But I ended up giving them a spell that only worked when you had at least two more despair, enjoy. So it's like, yeah, all this bad stuff happened to you, but that made you eligible for this.
Okay. Take the
You gotta,
failures and make them a prerequisite.
yeah, make some lemonade. But that actually gets to a really good point, which is that so
Vodka.
Invisible Sun is it's a large set. Like there's 4 books in the main black cube, and there's like 1,000 spells or something like that in these like spell cards. And I know other people have taken different approaches, but because A, my players are kind of new, and B, it's a game about secrets, I'm just like, look, I'm going to drip the information out. So I gave all the players access to the key, which is the main book for creating characters.
Okay.
And after that first session, I gave them access to the way, which is about magic. And I've just been dripping on information on the rest. They don't know what spells are available. They don't know what monsters are in these other worlds that they haven't been to. Like they just straight up don't know those things, and I don't tell them. And that's a kind of, again, you have to be upfront and be like, which way do you want to go? Some people want their players to have all the knowledge. I want my players to have all the knowledge that they need, and I'll happily give them, I have a player who just died and became a ghost. I just gave them all the rules on ghosts, but they didn't have that until now because they didn't need it until now.
Okay.
But it was super helpful for the spells because it's like the spells and the ephemera objects and the incantations. I gave them a starter set, and I basically said, you have to pick, here's 6 cards, you can pick 3 of them.
Okay.
So it was very limited choices, and I had hand selected it to be good for their characters, but good in different directions, and so they could kind of choose. And then that tells me something as to like, oh, you're attracted to that idea.
Looking at making things work.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I know for a fact, because I'm one of those people who once I know the rules, I tend to retain them really freaking well. I don't even need to look at the handbook or the DMG half the time. If I've looked it up before, I either know exactly where to find it, or I've got enough of the rules I can get the exact number, or just wing it. But I've played now with quite a few players who just do not have the ability to even focus while you try to give them all the information, let alone retain it. So I know for a fact that in that category, it could be an absolute fool's errand trying to give the players all the information ahead of time. And some of that means you have to have something of a relationship with the player, have an idea how they function. Are they someone who can easily assimilate this sort of information? If they are, like in D&D, then you can be like a wizard or a cleric right away and expect to be able to handle it. Other people, you look at them and go, you are not going to be able to remember all the stuff that goes along with a spellcasting feat.
Yeah.
I would seriously counsel you against that as a starting character. There's good stuff to be had elsewhere. It's a lot simpler.
Yeah, exactly. Like, well, and more than that too, I didn't want to give them too much of the setting books because I didn't know how much of it I was going to radically change.
True.
I mean, there is some stuff straight up where it's just like, what the book says is true, I am declaring false in this campaign. And some of that I'm telling the players, and some of it I'm telling them the false versions.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That's fantastic.
But yes, I am all for withholding information in the service of better storytelling.
Damn right. They'll find out when they need to know, or when someone else possibly in the campaign thinks they should know, or maybe they'll find out about it and they won't know what it is until later, and then afterwards they'll get a vantage point and go, oh, that's what that meant.
But the other thing that I've found leading into, and this is more of a social game type thing, but for especially larger campaigns, is the more organized you can be and the more at your fingertips anything is, the easier it's going to be. You want them to be able to be like, oh, I have this spell. Like, so when, pre-coronavirus, in the time that was before, I had little envelopes that just had all of their cards, all of their stuff. I had all of it available for them whenever they came over. And now we just use Notion. We have the character sheets, and just everything's there. We have a database for all the NPCs. We have a database for the locations, and so you know, everything's linked, and so you can be like, oh, who was that person? Oh yeah, they were
This person associated with this place, we encountered them in this circumstance.
Exactly. Yeah, you can see the session notes. You're like, oh, okay, that was where the context was, and that
Right.
kind of stuff has a positive feedback loop. Where very
Oh,
soon, it's not like, oh, what was that random name that we passed by, 3 levels ago? It's like, oh, like this is the person whose house we stayed at, and their cousin was sick, and whatever.
mhm.
I'm
There's a
making
lot
stuff
more
up.
emotional investment in
Yeah.
the people and places you've been.
Yeah, and being able to have, if they're able to have it more at their fingertips, then they're able to spend their mental energy on establishing those connections and building off of that, and not
Totally.
just being like, I'm floundering, I don't remember what's
Yeah, they can
going on.
outsource that part of their mental energy, and they can devote the more of their head to enjoying the moment.
Anyway, those are my rambles about Invisible Sun in first sessions. Do you have any closing thoughts or advice that you want to offer to, I guess, specifically for D&D GMs on your end that are kicking off with their own groups?
Know your world. Know it like the back of your hand if you can. Your players will ask you about stuff that is off the wall, that is new, that is weird, that is unsettling sometimes. You have to be able to convincingly answer them in your own head what you are willing to work with, what you are not. That's a form of preparedness at the beginning of it that I would say is very, very important, because it helps establish that you know the tone of your own game. That's one thing anyway.
My advice is probably the opposite, which is that you need to be ready to kill all your darlings.
I'll also do that. Those aren't
um,
mutually exclusive, though. That's the thing. Just because you know how your world would work doesn't mean you can't deal with something interacting with it.
yeah, no plan survives engagement with the enemy. Or the players, as it were. Well, hey, I'm going to end the broadcast here, but thank you again for your time tonight, Tyler, and
No
we hope
worries.
we'll see you guys all soon.
One can only hope.